The moon hung low and full, bathing the forest in its cold silver glow. On a jagged cliff overlooking a sea of blackened pines, a lone wolf stood tall. His fur, a weathered blend of ash and frost, rippled in the icy wind. This was Kyle, a creature carved by the wild, a wolf who had lived and hunted alone for as long as he could remember. Kyle raised his head and let out a howl, sharp, resonant, and unrelenting. It wasn't a cry for companionship, nor a plea for help. It was a sound of defiance, ripping through the silence and shaking the forest to its roots. The echoes chased themselves through the valleys, fading into a haunting whisper. He let out a low chuckle, almost human but distinctly wolfish, a rough ha, as if amused by his own audacity. Kyle always found it ironic. Here he was, alone and aging, yet still the most feared presence in these woods. His laughter trailed off, replaced by a soft growl that vibrated deep in his chest. Kyle had always been different. As a pup, he was the last of his litter to survive the cruel winter storms. His mother, a fierce but weary wolf, had raised him on stories of their kind, of strength, cunning, and the unbreakable spirit of the wolf. "Never bow, Kyle," she had whispered before vanishing one bitter morning. From then on, he had hunted alone, mastered the frozen forest alone, and thrived alone. The world, however, was changing. Humans had come with their fire and their iron. They laid traps that smelled of meat but snapped with teeth of steel. They burned the trees to make way for their settlements, driving prey deep into the mountains. Kale despised them. He had seen too many wolves fall to their greed, begging for scraps or captured in chains. A snarl escaped his throat at the memory. Grrr. It was a deep, rumbling sound, one that vibrated through his teeth and into the cold night air. Kyle kept his distance from everything. Humans, wolves, even the deer he hunted. To survive, he told himself, was to stay cold and sharp, to be untethered by the weakness of attachment. But now, his territory was under threat. A younger wolf had arrived, one with sharp eyes and a pack that followed his every command. They roamed with impunity, taking the prey that Kyle relied on. His once abundant forest grew quiet, his hunts turning desperate. Each time Kyle crossed paths with the young wolf, the encounters grew fiercer, leaving both scarred. One night, battered and hungry, Kale heard something strange. A faint howl echoed through the valley. It wasn't the pack's call. It was different, lonely, and raw. It tugged at something deep within Kale, a place he had long buried. For the first time, he felt an ache that even the coldest wind couldn't numb. Kyle growled to himself, shaking off the feeling. Ha. His rough laugh sounded again, this time bitter. Weakness, he muttered. Wolves who howled for others were wolves who fell into traps, who died tethered to something other than their own strength. He wouldn't let that happen to him. The next encounter with the young wolf was unavoidable. Kyle had cornered a limping deer near the edge of the forest, his stomach gnawing with hunger. But as he moved in for the kill, the pack appeared, their leader growling a challenge. The sound was low and menacing. And Kyle met it with his own. Their growls escalated, each trying to outmatch the other, until Kale snapped his jaws in warning, the sharp clack echoing like a whip crack. Kale's lips curled back in a snarl, baring yellowed teeth. He could have run. He had run before, but something in him snapped. He charged. The fight was brutal. Teeth tore through fur and flesh. Snarls, yelps, and sharp, pained growls filled the air. Blood stained the snow beneath them as Kyle fought with every ounce of cunning and strength he had. But he was no longer the wolf of his youth. Age and countless battles weighed on his limbs. The younger wolf was faster, stronger, and backed by his pack. As Kale fell to the ground, his breaths ragged and shallow, he gazed at the moon one last time. He could feel the end closing in, but his pride refused to let him fade quietly. With the last of his strength, Kyle threw back his head and howled. It was a howl unlike any other, a sound that carried the weight of a life lived on the edge, of battles fought alone, of unyielding defiance against a world that sought to crush him. It was raw and haunting, filled with both rage and sorrow, a cry that echoed through the mountains and silenced the forest. The young wolf froze, his victory forgotten as he listened to the mournful sound. The pack, too, stood still, their ears flattened, their eyes wide. When Kyle's howl faded into the wind, his body went still. The young wolf approached, hesitant, and sniffed at the fallen lone wolf. For a moment, he lingered, as though trying to understand the force that had kept Kyle standing all this time. Then he turned and led his pack away, leaving Kyle's body to the forest he had called his own. In his final howl, Kale declared more than his presence. He declared the spirit of the wolf, untamed, unapologetic, and fiercely independent. To Kale, pride wasn't arrogance or vanity. It was a quiet, unshakable belief in his identity. He didn't seek acceptance, not from a pack, not from humans, not even from the forest itself. His pride was his strength, his shield, and ultimately, his legacy. Even in death, Kyle remains a symbol of defiance, a reminder that to live with pride is to live on your own terms. His howl still echoes in the valleys, not as a cry for help, but as a testament to the lone wolf who stood tall against the world and refused to bow. So, as you hear the howl of a wolf carried by the wind, remember Kale, remember his pride, and remember that sometimes it's better to walk alone than to lose yourself in the crowd.